In the shadowed corridors of Renaissance Italy, where betrayal was currency and survival demanded psychological mastery, one man perfected the art of mental dominance with such ruthless precision that his methods became the blueprint for every master manipulator who followed. Cesare Borgia, the bastard son of Pope Alexander VI, didn't conquer territories through superior armies alone. He conquered minds. His techniques were so devastatingly effective that they transcended his era, embedding themselves into the very fabric of modern influence. Today, in boardrooms where billion-dollar decisions are made, in political campaigns that reshape nations, and on digital platforms that command the attention of billions, the ghost of Cesare Borgia continues to orchestrate human behavior, with invisible strings pulling at desires and fears that most people don't even realize they possess. This is not a historical curiosity piece about a long-dead Renaissance prince whose relevance ended with the fall of his papal kingdom. This is an excavation of the most sophisticated psychological warfare ever devised, techniques so powerful that they've been quietly shaping your decisions, your loyalties, your career choices, your political beliefs, and your very perception of reality for your entire life. Cesare Borgia understood something that modern psychology has only recently begun to validate through decades of rigorous scientific research. The human mind is not a fortress to be stormed through brute force, but a labyrinth to be navigated with surgical precision, with specific entry points that, once identified and exploited, grant total access to the inner sanctum of human will. What makes Borgia's approach so terrifyingly effective is its complete invisibility to the target. Unlike crude intimidation that triggers defensive responses or obvious bribery that people recognize as corruption, his methods operated entirely below the threshold of conscious awareness, making targets believe they were acting of their own free will while being meticulously guided toward predetermined outcomes. He didn't break people through torture or coercion. He reprogrammed them through psychological conditioning so subtle that they never realized their minds had been altered. And the most unsettling truth is this: every technique he pioneered is not only still in use today, but has been refined and amplified by modern technology, neuroscience research, and data analytics to a degree that would have impressed even this Renaissance master of manipulation. Consider the meteoric rise of a tech startup that, within 18 months, went from complete obscurity in a crowded garage to dominating an entire industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars. The founder, a relatively unknown entrepreneur with no previous major successes, managed to convince seasoned investors who had seen every pitch imaginable, skeptical media outlets trained to detect corporate deception, and cautious consumers burned by previous tech disappointments to not just support his vision, but to become evangelical advocates for it. Traditional business analysis couldn't explain this phenomenon. The product wasn't revolutionary compared to existing alternatives. The market wasn't starving for this particular solution, and the competition wasn't asleep at the wheel. Yet somehow, this company achieved what marketing experts call reality distortion. The ability to make people see the world differently simply through the power of strategic psychological influence. The techniques employed weren't modern innovations born from Silicon Valley think tanks or Madison Avenue advertising agencies. They were direct applications of Cesare Borgia's psychological playbook, adapted for the digital age, but fundamentally unchanged in their core mechanisms. The founder had never heard of Cesare Borgia, had never studied Renaissance history, and had certainly never read Machiavelli's detailed accounts of Borgia's methods. Yet he intuitively employed the same psychological principles that Borgia had perfected 5 centuries earlier, through trial and error in the most dangerous political environment in European history. This isn't coincidence. It's evidence of something far more profound and disturbing about human nature itself. The techniques Borgia developed tap into fundamental features of human psychology that are so universal, so hardwired into our cognitive architecture through millions of years of evolution, that they can be independently rediscovered by anyone who understands how the human mind actually works, as opposed to how we like to think it works. These psychological vulnerabilities aren't cultural artifacts that vary from society to society. They're biological constants that remain consistent across all human populations, regardless of education, intelligence, or cultural background. Niccolò Machiavelli, who served as Borgia's diplomatic observer during his most crucial campaigns and later became his chronicler and analyst, didn't just document political strategies in The Prince. He decoded a systematic approach to human psychology that Borgia had perfected through years of calculated experimentation on real human subjects in life or death situations. Machiavelli saw in Borgia not just a successful ruler who had managed to carve out a kingdom from nothing, but a master psychologist who understood the hidden mechanisms that drive human behavior at the most fundamental level. These weren't abstract theories developed in academic isolation. They were battle-tested techniques that had proven their effectiveness in the most high-stakes environment imaginable. The survival of a principality surrounded by enemies who possessed superior resources longer established legitimacy and every incentive to destroy this upstart bastard who threatened the established order. What you're about to discover are three fundamental techniques of psychological influence that Cesare Borgia developed and deployed with surgical precision across multiple campaigns and political situations. These aren't abstract concepts, suitable only for academic debate or historical analysis. They are practical tools that continue to shape the world around you every single day, from the apps on your phone, to the politicians you vote for, to the brands you trust. Each technique builds upon a specific vulnerability in human psychology, a weakness so universal and so persistent that it remains as exploitable today as it was 5 centuries ago. By understanding these techniques in detail, you'll begin to see the hidden architecture of influence that surrounds you like an invisible web. And more importantly, you'll gain the ability to recognize when these methods are being used against you by employers, marketers, politicians, and even friends and family members. But understanding these techniques also means confronting an uncomfortable truth about human nature itself that most people prefer to ignore. We like to believe that we're rational actors, making conscious choices based on careful evaluation of available information, weighing pros and cons with the dispassionate logic of a computer. The reality is far more disturbing. We're psychological creatures whose decisions are constantly being shaped by forces we do not recognize, through methods we don't understand, by people whose intentions we never question. Cesare Borgia didn't invent human psychological vulnerability. He simply became the first person to map it with scientific precision and exploit it with ruthless efficiency. The first technique Cesare Borgia mastered is what we might call strategic ambiguity and controlled uncertainty. Borgia understood that the human mind, when faced with incomplete information about important matters, doesn't simply wait patiently for clarity to emerge. It fills in the gaps with assumptions, hopes, fears, and projections based on previous experiences. More critically, he discovered that by carefully controlling what information people received, when they received it, through what channels and in what emotional context, he could essentially program their thought processes, leading them to conclusions that served his interests while making them believe these conclusions were their own independent insights, arrived at through careful analysis. In Chapter 7 of The Prince, Machiavelli describes in fascinating detail how Borgia dealt with the Orsini family, powerful Roman nobles who posed an existential threat to his expanding influence throughout central Italy. Rather than confronting them directly in open warfare, where their superior resources would give them an advantage, or revealing his ultimate intentions, which would allow them to prepare countermeasures, Borgia employed what Machiavelli calls beautiful deception. He writes, "The Duke found means to win over the Orsini, partly by gifts and partly by not showing his hand until he was ready to strike." This wasn't mere tactical patience or simple delay. It was sophisticated psychological engineering designed to create specific mental states in his targets. By maintaining strategic ambiguity about his true intentions while selectively revealing certain pieces of information at precisely calculated moments, Borgia created a state of controlled uncertainty that made his enemies more predictable, not less. This seems counterintuitive. We might expect that uncertainty would make people's behavior more random and harder to predict. But Borgia understood a deeper psychological principle. Uncertainty creates anxiety, and anxiety makes people seek patterns and certainty even when none exist. By controlling the information environment, he could influence not just what people knew, but how they thought about what they knew, what conclusions they drew from incomplete data, and what actions they took based on those conclusions. The psychological principle at work here operates on multiple levels simultaneously and involves several interconnected cognitive mechanisms. When people lack complete information about important situations, their minds automatically engage in what psychologists call pattern completion. The brain's desperate attempt to create coherent narratives from incomplete data. This isn't a conscious process that people can easily control. It happens automatically, below the threshold of awareness, as our brains desperately try to make sense of ambiguous situations that might affect our survival or well-being. Borgia realized that by controlling the information environment, he could influence not just what people knew, but how they thought about what they knew. He became the author of other people's internal narratives, a puppet master working through the medium of uncertainty itself. But his understanding went much deeper than simple information control. He recognized that uncertainty creates a specific psychological state that makes people more susceptible to influence from multiple directions simultaneously. When we're uncertain about important matters, we become hypervigilant, constantly scanning our environment for clues that might resolve our confusion and reduce our anxiety. This heightened attention makes us more likely to notice and overweight any information that seems relevant to our situation, even if that information is deliberately planted, strategically timed, or completely irrelevant to the actual situation. Uncertainty also creates anxiety, and anxiety makes people more likely to seek authority figures who can provide clarity and direction, even if those authority figures have ulterior motives. By creating and then managing uncertainty, Borgia could position himself as the solution to the very problem he had created. His targets would come to him seeking clarity, information, and guidance, never realizing that their confusion and anxiety were the result of his deliberate manipulation of their information environment. Consider the extraordinary case of Vitellozzo Vitelli, one of the most experienced and successful condottieri, mercenary commanders, of his era. Vitelli had survived decades of Italian warfare through cunning, brutality, and an almost supernatural ability to detect deception and political manipulation. He had navigated the treacherous politics of Renaissance Italy by trusting no one completely, maintaining multiple escape routes, and always assuming that every interaction contained hidden agendas. His survival instincts had been honed by years of experience in an environment where a single mistake could mean death. Yet Borgia managed to lure him into a trap that cost him his life, not through superior military force or obvious deception, but through masterful manipulation of information and timing that exploited Vitelli's own intelligence and experience against him. The campaign against Vitelli began months before their final meeting and involved a sophisticated psychological operation that would impress modern intelligence agencies. Borgia had been sending Vitelli mixed signals for months, sometimes appearing as a potential ally, offering valuable partnerships, sometimes as a potential threat, requiring careful monitoring, always maintaining just enough ambiguity to keep Vitelli guessing about his true intentions and ultimate goals. These weren't random mixed messages or simple deception. They were carefully calibrated psychological interventions designed to create specific mental states and behavioral responses. When Borgia acted friendly and cooperative, he would provide Vitelli with valuable intelligence about mutual enemies, creating feelings of gratitude and partnership while demonstrating his value as an ally. But he would also subtly question Vitelli's military decisions and political judgment, undermining his confidence while appearing to offer helpful advice from a more experienced perspective. When Borgia acted distant or potentially threatening, he would do so in ways that could be interpreted multiple ways, creating ambiguity that forced Vitelli to constantly analyze and reanalyze the situation. A delayed response to an important message could be seen as either deliberate disrespect, requiring a strong response, or simple administrative oversight that should be ignored. A military maneuver near Vitelli's territory could be preparation for an attack requiring immediate defensive measures or merely strategic positioning against other enemies that had nothing to do with Vitelli. This systematic ambiguity created a state of chronic uncertainty that gradually wore down Vitelli's psychological defenses and decision-making capabilities. The brilliance of this approach becomes clear when we understand how chronic uncertainty affects decision-making processes in the human brain. When people are constantly uncertain about important matters that affect their survival and success, they experience what psychologists call cognitive load. Their mental resources become depleted from constantly trying to resolve ambiguous situations and prepare for multiple possible scenarios simultaneously. This cognitive exhaustion makes them more likely to rely on mental shortcuts and emotional responses rather than careful analysis. It also makes them more susceptible to influence from anyone who seems to offer clarity, certainty, or relief from the burden of constant vigilance. The uncertainty itself becomes a form of psychological torture that makes people desperate for resolution, even if that resolution comes from untrustworthy sources. When Borgia finally invited Vitelli to a meeting in Senegalia, ostensibly to discuss a joint military campaign against mutual enemies, Vitelli's own intelligence network could not determine whether this was a genuine opportunity for profitable cooperation or an elaborate trap designed to eliminate him. The uncertainty itself became a weapon that Borgia wielded with devastating effectiveness. Vitelli, faced with incomplete information and pressured by the need to make a decision that could affect his entire future, chose to attend the meeting based on his own pattern completion. He convinced himself that the potential benefits of cooperation outweighed the risks of betrayal and that his own experience and precautions would protect him from any treachery. He was catastrophically wrong. Borgia had him strangled that very night, along with several other condottieri who had fallen into the same psychological trap. Modern psychology has extensively validated Borgia's intuitive understanding of how uncertainty affects decision-making through decades of research in cognitive psychology and behavioral economics. Studies show that when people face ambiguous situations, they rely heavily on cognitive shortcuts called heuristics, which are systematic biases in thinking that can be predicted and exploited by those who understand them. The availability heuristic makes people overweight information that's easily recalled, regardless of its actual relevance or accuracy. The anchoring effect causes them to rely too heavily on the first piece of information they receive, even when subsequent information contradicts it. The confirmation bias leads people to seek out information that confirms their existing beliefs while ignoring contradictory evidence that might change their conclusions. Borgia didn't know these technical terms, but he understood these principles intimately and used them to create what we might call cognitive dependency, a state where targets became reliant on him for the information needed to make sense of their situation. By controlling the flow of information, he could essentially control how people thought about their circumstances, their options, and their relationships with him. Think about how this technique manifests in today's digital landscape with unprecedented sophistication and reach. Social media algorithms don't just show you information randomly. They create carefully curated information environments designed to influence your emotional state and decision-making process in ways that serve the platform's commercial interests. The algorithm determines not just what you see, but when you see it, in what context, surrounded by what other information, and with what emotional framing. This creates a form of strategic ambiguity where you never have complete information about what's happening in the world, but you're constantly receiving fragments that your brain automatically tries to assemble into coherent narratives. The platform controls not just the information you receive, but the context in which you receive it, the emotional state you're in when you process it, and the social feedback you get when you respond to it. A political campaign doesn't just present its candidates' positions and hope voters will make rational choices. It strategically releases information in sequences designed to create specific emotional and cognitive responses in different voter segments. Opposition research isn't just used to attack opponents directly, it's held in reserve and released at precisely calculated moments to maximize psychological impact and minimize the target's ability to respond effectively. The goal isn't just to inform voters about policy differences, it's to create information environments that lead voters to specific conclusions, while making them feel like they've arrived at those conclusions through independent analysis of objective facts. The campaign controls not just what information becomes public, but when it becomes public. Through what channels, in what context, and with what emotional framing. A tech company doesn't just announce a product and hope the market will respond positively. It orchestrates a months-long campaign of strategic leaks, rumors, and partial revelations designed to build anticipation and shape market expectations. The company controls not just what information becomes public, but when it becomes public, through what channels, to what audiences, and in what context. This creates a state of controlled uncertainty that keeps potential customers, competitors, and investors constantly guessing while gradually building psychological momentum toward the desired outcome. By the time the product is officially announced, the market has already been psychologically prepared to respond in predictable ways. These aren't coincidences or natural market phenomena. They are direct applications of Borgia's understanding that controlling the information environment allows you to influence how people think, not just what they think about. The techniques have been refined and amplified by modern technology, data analytics, and psychological research, but the underlying principles remain exactly the same as those Borgia employed 5 centuries ago. The practical application of this technique is both powerful and ethically complex. In negotiations, the party who controls the flow and timing of information holds a decisive advantage. They can create uncertainty that makes the other party more eager to reach agreement, or they can provide selective information that shapes how the other party evaluates their options and alternatives. In leadership, the ability to manage uncertainty can be the difference between inspiring confidence during crisis and creating panic that destroys organizational effectiveness. A skilled leader knows when to provide complete transparency and when to maintain strategic ambiguity that allows followers to project their own hopes and fears onto the situation in ways that motivate desired behaviors. In personal relationships, Understanding how people respond to ambiguity can help you communicate more effectively and avoid unintended manipulation. But this knowledge also reveals how vulnerable we all are to those who would exploit our cognitive biases for their own ends. The key is developing what we might call information literacy. The ability to recognize when information environments are being manipulated and to seek out additional sources that provide different perspectives and fill in missing context. The second technique Borgia perfected is emotional anchoring and psychological conditioning. Unlike his contemporaries who relied primarily on crude fear tactics or simple reward systems, Borgia understood that the most powerful form of influence comes from creating deep emotional associations that operate below the level of conscious awareness and continue to influence behavior long after the initial conditioning experience. He realized that by carefully orchestrating people's emotional experiences in specific sequences and contexts, he could essentially program their future responses to specific stimuli, creating a form of psychological conditioning that made them predictable and controllable without their awareness. In Chapter 8 of The Prince, Machiavelli recounts in vivid detail how Borgia dealt with the complex problem of governing the Romagna, a region notorious throughout Italy for its lawlessness, resistance to central authority, and history of violent rebellion against outside rule. Rather than simply imposing harsh rule through military occupation, which would have required constant vigilance and enormous resources, Borgia employed what Machiavelli describes as a masterpiece of psychological manipulation that solved multiple problems simultaneously. He appointed Ramiro de Orco, a cruel and efficient administrator known for his ruthless methods, to pacify the region through whatever means necessary. Ramiro systematically eliminated bandits, corrupt officials, and local strongmen who had been terrorizing the population, using methods so brutal that they shocked even the violence-hardened inhabitants of Renaissance Italy. Once order was established and the people had experienced the benefits of stability and security for the first time in generations, Borgia made a move that demonstrated his psychological genius. He had Ramiro publicly executed and his body displayed in the town square of Cesena, cut in half with a bloody knife placed beside the corpse. Machiavelli writes, "The ferocity of this spectacle left the people at once satisfied and stupefied. This wasn't random violence or simple scapegoating. It was calculated emotional engineering designed to create specific psychological associations that would influence the population's relationship with Borgia's rule for years to come. The brilliance of this strategy lies in its sophisticated understanding of emotional anchoring, the psychological principle that emotional experiences create lasting changes in how people respond to similar situations in the future." Borgia created a carefully orchestrated sequence of emotional experiences that conditioned the population's response to his authority in ways that served his long-term interests. First, they experienced chaos, fear, and helplessness under the previous system of local strongmen and bandits. Then they experienced relief, gratitude, and security when Ramiro brought order through his harsh but effective methods. Finally, they experienced a complex mixture of satisfaction, justice was done to a cruel oppressor, or Borgia's power was absolute and unpredictable, and fear, this could happen to anyone who opposed him when Ramiro was executed. Each emotional state was carefully orchestrated to create positive associations with Borgia's authority, while simultaneously demonstrating the consequences of opposing him. The people weren't just governed through force, they were psychologically conditioned to accept and even desire his rule. The execution of Ramiro served multiple psychological functions simultaneously. It satisfied the people's desire for justice against a cruel oppressor, demonstrated Borgia's ultimate authority over even his most powerful subordinates, and created a powerful emotional memory that would influence their future responses to his rule. But Borgia's understanding of emotional conditioning went far beyond this single dramatic gesture. He understood that emotional associations are built through repeated experiences over time, and he systematically created patterns of emotional experience that reinforced his desired psychological outcomes. When dealing with potential allies, he would create cycles of tension and relief that made them emotionally dependent on his approval and validation. When managing potential threats, he would orchestrate experiences of fear and gratitude that made them psychologically invested in maintaining his favor. These weren't random emotional manipulations. They were systematic conditioning programs designed to create specific psychological dependencies and behavioral patterns. Modern psychology has extensively documented how emotional experiences create lasting changes in brain structure and function through a process called neuroplasticity. The amygdala, our brain's alarm system, forms particularly strong memories around emotionally charged events, a phenomenon psychologists call emotional memory enhancement. These emotional memories don't just influence how we remember past events. They actively shape how we respond to similar situations in the future by creating automatic emotional and behavioral responses. Borgia intuitively understood that by controlling people's emotional experiences, he could literally rewire their brains to respond to him in predictable ways. He was practicing a primitive form of what we now call neuromarketing, the use of psychological techniques to influence behavior at the neurological level by creating specific neural pathways and associations. Consider the case of Oliverotto da Fermo, a young condottiere who had seized control of his hometown through treachery and violence. Oliverotto was known throughout Italy for his paranoia, his ability to detect and counter political manipulation, and his ruthless elimination of anyone who posed a threat to his power. He had survived in the cutthroat world of Renaissance politics by trusting no one, analyzing every interaction for hidden motives, and always assuming that everyone around him was trying to manipulate or destroy him. His survival instincts had been honed by his own rise to power, which involved betraying and murdering his own uncle, who had raised him and trusted him completely. This act of ultimate treachery had taught him that anyone could be betrayed by those closest to them, and he lived in constant fear that others would do to him what he had done to his uncle. Yet Borgia managed to neutralize him using pure emotional conditioning, demonstrating the power of this technique even against sophisticated targets who were actively trying to resist manipulation and who had every reason to be suspicious of Borgia's motives. The campaign against Oliverotto began with careful intelligence gathering and psychological profiling. Borgia's agents studied Oliverotto's personality, his fears, his ambitions, his emotional triggers, and his psychological vulnerabilities. They discovered that despite his outward confidence and ruthless behavior, Oliverotto was deeply insecure about his legitimacy as a ruler and haunted by guilt over his betrayal of his uncle. He had gained power through betraying someone who loved and trusted him, and this act of treachery haunted him constantly. He was desperate for validation that he was a legitimate leader rather than merely a successful traitor, and he constantly sought approval from other powerful figures who might confirm his worth and status. Armed with this detailed psychological profile, Borgia orchestrated a series of interactions with Oliverotto that created specific emotional patterns designed to exploit these vulnerabilities. He would alternate between showing respect for Oliverotto's military skills and subtly questioning his political judgment. These interactions were carefully designed to trigger Oliverotto's insecurities, while positioning Borgia as a source of the validation he desperately craved. When Borgia praised Oliverotto's tactical abilities and military achievements, it created feelings of pride and gratitude that made Oliverotto associate Borgia with positive emotions and self-worth. When he questioned Oliverotto's political decisions or suggested alternative approaches, it created anxiety and self-doubt that could only be resolved by earning Borgia's approval and validation. Borgia would also offer valuable intelligence about mutual enemies, creating feelings of gratitude and partnership, then withdraw slightly, creating anxiety about losing his favor and support. Each interaction was designed to strengthen Oliverotto's emotional dependence on Borgia's approval while weakening his confidence in his own judgment and decision-making abilities. The conditioning was so subtle that Oliverotto never recognized it as manipulation. He simply found himself increasingly drawn to seek Borgia's opinion and approval. The psychological mechanism at work here involves what modern researchers call intermittent reinforcement, a pattern of rewards and punishments that creates particularly strong psychological dependencies. When rewards come at unpredictable intervals, they create more powerful conditioning than consistent rewards or punishments. This is the same principle that makes gambling addictive. The unpredictable nature of the rewards creates a psychological dependency that's extremely difficult to break. Borgia intuitively understood this principle and used it to create emotional dependencies that were difficult for his targets to recognize or resist. When Borgia finally invited Oliverotto to the same meeting where Vitelli was killed, Oliverotto's emotional conditioning overrode his rational caution and survival instincts. Despite having every reason to suspect a trap, despite his paranoid nature and his knowledge of Borgia's ruthless methods, his psychological need for Borgia's validation made him vulnerable to manipulation. He had been conditioned to associate Borgia's approval with feelings of security and legitimacy, while Borgia's disapproval triggered anxiety and self-doubt. The invitation to the meeting felt like an opportunity to secure the validation he craved, and this emotional response overwhelmed his rational analysis of the risks involved. He too was executed that night. This technique of emotional anchoring is everywhere in modern society, though few people recognize it for what it is. Luxury brands don't just sell products, they create emotional experiences designed to associate their brand with feelings of status, success, and self-worth. The entire luxury industry is built on emotional conditioning, creating associations between products and positive emotional states that make consumers willing to pay premium prices for items that may not be functionally superior to cheaper alternatives. Political movements don't just advocate for policies. They orchestrate emotional journeys that create deep psychological bonds between supporters and the cause. Campaign rallies, protest marches, and political conventions are all designed to create powerful emotional experiences that strengthen supporters' identification with the movement. These events don't just inform people about policy positions, they create emotional memories that influence future political behavior. Social media platforms don't just connect people, they use sophisticated algorithms to create emotional dependency through carefully timed rewards and social validation. The like button, the notification sound, the endless scroll of content. All of these features are designed to create intermittent reinforcement patterns that keep users emotionally engaged with the platform. The goal isn't just to provide information or entertainment, it's to create psychological dependencies that drive continued engagement and data collection. Even personal relationships often involve unconscious emotional conditioning as people learn to associate certain behaviors with emotional rewards or punishments. Healthy relationships involve positive emotional conditioning that strengthens bonds and encourages beneficial behaviors. Unhealthy relationships often involve negative conditioning patterns that create dependencies and undermine self-confidence. The power of this technique lies in its complete invisibility to the target. Unlike obvious manipulation that people can recognize and resist, emotional anchoring operates through the natural learning processes of the brain. People don't feel manipulated. They feel like they're making authentic emotional connections and responding to genuine feelings. This makes it both incredibly effective and potentially dangerous, as it can create psychological dependencies that are difficult to recognize and even harder to break. Understanding emotional conditioning allows you to recognize when it's being used against you and to make more conscious choices about the emotional associations you allow to form. It also provides insight into how you can build healthier emotional patterns in your own relationships and decision-making processes. The third and perhaps most sophisticated technique Borgia developed is identity manipulation and narrative control. Borgia understood that people's sense of identity, who they believe themselves to be at the deepest level, is not fixed or immutable, but fluid and constantly being reinforced or challenged by external feedback and social narratives. More importantly, he realized that by controlling the narratives through which people understood themselves and their place in the world, he could essentially rewrite their identities to align with his objectives. This wasn't just about changing minds or influencing behavior. It was about changing souls, transforming people at the most fundamental level of their self-concept. In Chapter 11 of The Prince, Machiavelli discusses ecclesiastical principalities and notes how Borgia, despite being the son of a pope and having grown up surrounded by religious authority, understood that religious power derived not from divine mandate or moral authority, but from sophisticated narrative control. Machiavelli observes, "These principalities alone are secure and happy because they are sustained by ancient religious customs, which are so powerful and of such quality that they keep their princes in power no matter how they live or act." Borgia saw that the church's power came not from its moral authority or the virtue of its leaders, but from its ability to control the fundamental narratives through which people understood reality, morality, and their own purpose in life. The church didn't just tell people what to believe, it provided the entire framework through which they understood themselves and their relationship to the world. Borgia applied this insight to secular governance with devastating effectiveness. Rather than simply conquering territories and imposing his rule through force, he conquered identities and transformed how people saw themselves. He understood that lasting power required not just compliance or submission, but genuine psychological transformation, making people want to be the kind of people who would naturally support his rule. This required sophisticated understanding of how identity formation works and how narratives shape self-perception. The psychological mechanism behind this technique involves what modern researchers call narrative identity theory. People don't just have identities, they are constantly constructing and reconstructing their sense of self through the stories they tell about their experiences, their relationships, their successes and failures, and their place in the larger world. These narratives aren't just descriptions of reality. They actively shape reality by influencing future behavior, choices, and relationships. When people see themselves as heroes in their own stories, they act heroically and seek out opportunities to demonstrate their heroic qualities. When they see themselves as victims, they act like victims and interpret events through the lens of victimhood. When they see themselves as loyal supporters of a cause, they act with loyalty and dedication, even when that loyalty conflicts with their immediate self-interest. Borgia realized that by influencing the stories people told about themselves, he could influence who they became. This wasn't just about propaganda or persuasion, it was about fundamental identity transformation. He understood that the most powerful form of control comes not from forcing people to act against their nature, but from changing their nature so that they naturally act in ways that serve your interests. Consider how Borgia handled the integration of newly conquered territories. Rather than simply imposing his rule through military occupation and hoping for eventual acceptance, he systematically worked to change how the inhabitants saw themselves and their relationship to power. He would begin by identifying the existing narratives that gave people their sense of identity, their local traditions, their historical grievances, their cultural heroes, their shared memories of past struggles and triumphs. Then he would gradually introduce new elements into these narratives that positioned his rule not as foreign domination or conquest, but as the natural evolution of their own story. Local leaders who submitted to his authority weren't portrayed as traitors to their people, but as wise protectors who had secured their community's future through pragmatic decision-making. Resistance wasn't framed as patriotic defiance or heroic struggle, but as destructive nostalgia that threatened the community's prosperity and security. The narrative gradually shifted from "we are proud people defending our independence against foreign invaders" to "we are practical people securing our prosperity through wise alliances." This wasn't just changing people's opinions about political arrangements. It was changing how they saw themselves and what they valued. The transformation was so complete that people genuinely believed they were acting according to their true nature and deepest values, even as those values had been subtly altered to serve Borgia's interests. The city of Faenza provides a perfect example of this technique in action. When Borgia besieged the city, he could have taken it by force relatively quickly through direct assault. Instead, he chose to conduct a prolonged siege that created specific psychological conditions designed to transform the defenders' sense of identity and their understanding of their situation. As the siege continued and resources dwindled, the narrative inside the city gradually shifted. Initially, the defenders saw themselves as heroic patriots defending their freedom and independence against a foreign invader. This identity gave them strength and motivation to endure hardship and continue fighting despite overwhelming odds. But as the siege dragged on and casualties mounted, Borgia's agents inside the city began promoting a different story. These agents didn't directly attack the patriotic narrative. Instead, they introduced new elements that gradually transformed it. They began spreading stories about the corruption and incompetence of the city's leadership, suggesting that the real enemy wasn't Borgia, but the stubborn leaders who were prolonging unnecessary suffering. They promoted narratives that portrayed submission to Borgia not as defeat or betrayal, but as a pragmatic choice that would save innocent lives and preserve the city's future. They emphasized Borgia's reputation for treating surrendered cities well, and his ability to provide security and prosperity to those who accepted his rule. The psychological transformation was gradual, but profound. The defenders began to see themselves not as heroes defending freedom, but as suffering people trapped by stubborn leaders who cared more about their own pride than their people's welfare. The narrative shifted from "we are brave defenders of freedom" to "we are victims of our leaders' destructive pride." When the city finally surrendered, it wasn't because they had been militarily defeated, but because they had been psychologically transformed. They now saw submission to Borgia not as defeat, but as liberation from their previous leaders' destructive policies. The surrender felt like a victory for common sense and compassion rather than a defeat for patriotism and independence. Modern psychology has extensively documented how narrative identity shapes behavior through what researchers call identity-based motivation. People are powerfully motivated to act in ways that are consistent with their self-concept, even when those actions conflict with their immediate interests or rational analysis of their situation. This creates what psychologists call cognitive consistency. the drive to maintain harmony between our beliefs, our identity, and our actions. Borgia understood this principle intuitively and used it to create what we might call manufactured authenticity. Situations where people genuinely believed they were acting according to their true nature while actually behaving according to his design. The key was not to force people to act against their identity, but to gradually reshape their identity so that the desired behaviors felt natural and authentic. This technique is perhaps the most prevalent form of influence in contemporary society. Political movements don't just advocate for policies, they offer complete identity packages that tell people who they are and what kind of person they should aspire to be. Supporting a particular political party becomes not just a policy preference, but a core aspect of personal identity that influences everything from career choices to social relationships. People don't just vote for candidates, they vote for versions of themselves. The political identity becomes so central to their self-concept that they interpret all new information through the lens of that identity, accepting information that confirms their political beliefs and rejecting information that challenges them. Consumer brands don't just sell products, they sell identity narratives that allow people to express and reinforce their self-concept through their purchasing decisions. Buying an iPhone isn't just purchasing a communication device, it's expressing an identity as someone who values design, innovation, and premium quality. Driving a Tesla isn't just transportation, it's expressing an identity as someone who cares about the environment and embraces cutting-edge technology. Social media platforms don't just facilitate communication, they provide tools for identity construction and validation that can be subtly influenced through algorithmic manipulation. The content you see, the interactions you have, and the feedback you receive all contribute to shaping your sense of who you are and what you value. The algorithm doesn't just show you content you'll find interesting, it shows you content that reinforces certain aspects of your identity while potentially suppressing others. The power of identity manipulation lies in its apparent authenticity. Unlike other forms of influence that people might recognize and resist, identity-based influence feels like self-discovery rather than external manipulation. People don't feel like they're being changed. They feel like they're becoming more truly themselves. This makes it both the most effective and the most ethically problematic of Borgia's techniques. Understanding identity manipulation requires recognizing that your sense of self is not as fixed as you might believe. Your identity is constantly being shaped by the narratives you encounter, the feedback you receive, and the stories you tell about your experiences. By becoming more conscious of these influences, you can maintain greater agency over your own identity formation and resist attempts to manipulate your self-concept for others' benefit. These three techniques, strategic ambiguity and controlled uncertainty, emotional anchoring and psychological conditioning, and identity manipulation and narrative control, represent the core of Cesare Borgia's psychological arsenal. What makes them so enduringly powerful is that they exploit fundamental features of human psychology that haven't changed in 500 years. Our brains still respond to uncertainty by seeking patterns, still form emotional associations that influence future behavior, and still construct identity through narrative. These aren't bugs in the human system. They're features that served important evolutionary functions. But in the hands of a master manipulator like Borgia, they become vulnerabilities that can be systematically exploited. The modern world has amplified these techniques beyond anything Borgia could have imagined. Digital technology allows for unprecedented precision in controlling information environments, creating emotional experiences, and shaping identity narratives. Social media algorithms can create personalized uncertainty that drives engagement. Marketing campaigns can trigger specific emotional responses with scientific precision. Political movements can offer customized identity packages that feel perfectly tailored to individual psychological needs. But understanding these techniques doesn't just provide insight into historical manipulation. It offers essential protection against contemporary influence operations. When you recognize strategic ambiguity being used to control your information environment, you can seek out additional sources and resist pattern completion. When you notice emotional anchoring being used to create psychological dependencies, you can step back and evaluate relationships and commitments more objectively. When you see identity manipulation being used to shape your self-concept, you can maintain agency over your own narrative. This knowledge also carries responsibility. These techniques are morally neutral tools that can be used for beneficial or harmful purposes. A leader who understands uncertainty can provide clarity during crisis. Someone who understands emotional conditioning can build healthier relationships. A person who understands identity formation can help others develop more authentic self-concepts. The key is conscious, ethical application rather than unconscious manipulation. The legacy of Cesare Borgia extends far beyond the Renaissance courts, where he first perfected these methods. Every time a political candidate carefully manages the release of information to shape public perception, every time a company creates emotional experiences designed to build brand loyalty, every time a social movement offers identity narratives that transform how people see themselves. The ghost of Borgia is present, his techniques adapted and amplified for new contexts, but fundamentally unchanged in their psychological sophistication. The question isn't whether these techniques will continue to be used. They will. The question is whether you'll be an unconscious target or a conscious participant in the psychological landscape they create. Will you be someone who recognizes when information environments are being manipulated to influence your thinking? Will you understand when emotional experiences are being orchestrated to create psychological dependencies? Will you maintain agency over your own identity narrative rather than allowing others to write your story for you? The choice is yours, but only if you understand that there is a choice to be made. Cesare Borgia's greatest victory wasn't any particular territory he conquered or enemy he defeated. His greatest victory was creating techniques of influence so subtle and so powerful that they could operate for centuries without their targets even realizing they were being influenced. Breaking free from that influence requires first recognizing its existence, then understanding its methods, and finally developing the psychological sophistication to navigate a world where these techniques are constantly being deployed. The Renaissance is over, but the psychological warfare it birthed continues. The question is whether you will be a casualty or a commander in the battles being fought for your mind. Cesare Borgia showed us both the techniques and the stakes. The rest is up to you. What aspect of Borgia's psychological manipulation do you find most disturbing? And where do you see these techniques being used most effectively in today's world? Share your observations in the comments below and subscribe to this channel for more insights into the hidden mechanisms of power and influence that continue to shape our reality. The age of unconscious manipulation is ending, but only for those who choose to see beyond the carefully constructed illusions that surround us.